Hi, we're out here on the range today, and once again we're talking about shotguns as a home defense gun. Today specifically 410 bore shotguns. And the first thing I want to say is that a lot of people have asked to see a presentation on this subject, and it is because of donations to the Patreon account that I've finally been able to get a 410 shotgun and do it. Also, in the near future, I'll be able to obtain the 10mm and 357 SIG so many people have asked about. So, thank you everybody. Now, on the subject of home defense shotguns, shotguns have been the mainstay of home defense guns for many, many decades. It's only been recently that it's become trendy for people to say that they're inadequate to the task or that they suck for home defense. This is why I have a presentation entitled Shotguns Don't Suck for Home Defense. I've also got one entitled Birdshot in Your Home Defense Shotgun, and then just an introduction to shotguns. And because those are already out there, I don't want to rehash a lot of the things that I've said before, so I'm going to give you the short version of a few things. Now, in talking about the 410 bore as a home defense gun, is it adequate to the task? Well, the question really is, why wouldn't it be? Let me show you some shot shells. This is a 12 gauge 2 3/4 inch shell, and if loaded properly, I take it as axiomatic that it is sufficient for home defense. This is a 20 gauge 2 3/4 inch shell, and I stress, if loaded properly, it is absolutely adequate for home defense. A 410 becomes questionable because it is a lot skinnier than the other two. Now, 410 is measured in bore. It's .410 bore. If you put a gauge number on it, according to what I read, it'd be 67 gauge. It's got a lot less powder and shot than the other two. Even though this one is a 3-inch Magnum and it's a little longer than the others, it's still not nearly as much powder and shot. Now, today I'm going to compare the 12 gauge 2 3/4 inch to the 410 3-inch Magnum, because most of your personal protection ammunition for 410 is in 3-inch Magnum, and I consider the 12 gauge 2 3/4 inch to be more common than the 3 or 3.5 inch Magnum versions in home defense guns, and generally speaking, quite often a better idea. Now, the real question is two things. Is the 12 gauge really more powerful than the 410? Well, it's a lot bigger and it holds more pellets. This 410 shell has 5 pellets of triple-aught buck. Now, triple-aught buck is just 36 caliber lead spheres. This 12 gauge shell has 8 pellets. Well, 8 is certainly more than 5, but is it really more powerful? Now, what I mean is there really more velocity behind these pellets coming out of the 12 gauge round than there is coming out of the 410? Is it, pellet for pellet, more powerful? And even if it is the 410 powerful enough? Well, let's shoot these two side by side and see if we can shed any light on that. Now, the shotguns I'm going to use today is this Mossberg Model 500 12 gauge with a 20-inch barrel, and this Mossberg Model 510 in 410 bore with an 18.5-inch barrel. So there's a little difference in the barrel lengths, but I think it's close enough we can get a good feel for the comparative velocity. Now, normally you see me shoot the chronograph from 7 yards, but due to the nature of shot shells, I'm going to shoot it from 4 yards this time. And we'll start with the 12 gauge, and I'm loaded with Federal 2 3/4 inch triple-aught buck 8 pellet. 1302, 1288, 1299, 1251. Now let's see how that compares to the 410. Now for the 410, I've got Federal 410 3-inch Magnum triple-aught buck 5 pellet. 960, 960, 966, 950. Now let's go crunch the numbers. So how'd we do? Well, with the 12 gauge, we got a mean velocity of 1,285 feet per second. With the 410, we get 959. Let's round that off to 960. That means the 12 gauge gave us a mean velocity of 325 feet per second more. Now, granted, the 410 does have a barrel that's 1.5 inches shorter, and that might give us a little less velocity, but certainly doesn't account for 325 feet per second less. The 12 gauge is a lot more powerful and has more pellets. Now, more pellets obviously means more holes in what you're shooting at, but that's not all of the story. There's also something we call hit probability. Now, let me show you what I mean. Part of having greater pellet count is what we call hit probability. As your pattern goes downrange, it spreads out. And as the pattern gets fairly big, more pellets will give you a denser pattern and a greater chance of hitting something. So what I'm going to do is go back 35 yards and I'll shoot the target on your left with the 12 gauge triple-aught buck 8 pellet and the target on your right with the 410 bore triple-aught buck 5 pellet. Now it would stand to reason that with more pellets there'll be more impacts on this target, but remember the 410 is coming out of a much smaller bore and is going to have a whole lot tighter pattern when it starts out. So let's see if the higher pellet count of the 12 gauge does us any good. So with our 12 gauge on our silhouette we have 11 impacts, and with our 410 we only have 7. So I'd say the higher pellet count definitely did us some good. However, this is at 35 yards, and unless your name happens to be Bill Gates or Paul Allen, you probably don't have any 35-yard distances inside your house. Let's try this same drill at a little more realistic distance. Now I'll shoot the target on your left with the 12 gauge and the target on your right with the 410, but from a distance of 5 yards. And there you have it. That's all 8 pellets in the center of that target. The one big hit that didn't go through, that's the shot cup. With the 410, that's all 5 pellets in the red center of that target. The one hit that's high is again the shot cup. Which brings up the debate, can the shot cup or wad in a shot shell do any real damage? In this case, neither one even went through the paper. Now it would get hurt if you got hit by it, but I think it's not really relevant next to getting hit with 5 pellets of buckshot. Also, you'll hear people talk about how the degree of choke in a shotgun barrel will affect the pattern spread. It absolutely does. But at the short distances of typical home defense shootings, it doesn't really make any difference. This gun has an improved cylinder bore barrel, and 8 pellets are still in the center. But as far as comparing the 12 gauge to the 410, we can say that at typical home defense distances, 8 pellets versus 5 did not make any difference at all in hit probability. So we see at 35 yards, granted an excessive distance when you're talking about home defense, the 12 gauge with 8 pellets per shell puts more hits on target than the 410 with 5 pellets per shell, even though the 410 I was using has a modified choke. It has more choke than the improved cylinder bore of the 12 gauge I was using. In this case, that just does not trump pellet count. Now, speaking of pellet count, can you get 410 ammo with more pellets? Yes. Here's some 410 ammo that is number 4 buckshot. It has 9 pellets. But compared to 12 gauge, here's some 12 gauge 2 3/4 inch number 4 buckshot with 34 pellets. There's also some you can buy with 27. So no matter how you slice it, the 12 gauge's pellet count is going to give you greater hits at long distances. Now at the much more realistic distance of 5 yards, we see it doesn't matter what your pellet count or your choke is. It's going to be such a tight pattern that as far as hit probability goes, it won't really make any difference. But you certainly could argue that hitting the intended target with 8 pellets of triple-aught buck is going to be more effective than hitting the target with 5 pellets. That sounds logical. Especially when those pellets are propelled out of the 12 gauge at 325 feet per second greater than they are out of the 410. Well, right about now is when someone's going to argue, if you're going to use a 410, why not just use a Taurus Judge revolver? Well, there's a couple of things there. First, the very short barrel out of the Judge revolver will, at close distances, give you a little bit greater spread, but not enough so to enhance your hit probability. While at distances like 35 yards, those pellets have spread out so much that very few of them will hit the intended target. There's also the matter of, out of the very short barrel the Judge has, you lose a lot of velocity. Now, I tried to chronograph it, but the patterns that you get with buckshot out of the Judge does not give you a really good reading in the chronograph. But here's a box of 410 3-inch Magnum triple-aught buck that's advertised to be used in a handgun, and it's got an advertised velocity of 775 feet per second printed on the box. And in previous demonstrations, we've seen that the advertised velocity on the box is quite often optimistic. You're probably going to get less than the 775. So with our 12 gauge propelling triple-aught buck at 1285 and the 410 shotgun at 960, when you go down 200 feet per second less than that, you're really robbing yourself of a lot of power. Now, people would argue that you could use the Judge revolver loaded with slugs or conventional .45 Colt ammunition. You could do that. You certainly can't load your 410 shotgun with .45 Colt ammunition. That's not a good idea at all. But if you're going to load your revolver with .45 Colt ammunition, then just get a conventional revolver and use conventional ammunition and go with that. So are there any really good reasons that someone would select a .410 shotgun for home defense? Yes, a couple of them. Let me show you. One of the advantages the .410 can give you is a lot less recoil. Now I'll shoot both and we'll see if you can perceive any difference in the recoil. A lot less recoil, even though the .410 is a much lighter, much smaller gun. And the advantage of it being much smaller is that you can use it in tight spaces like inside your house. And the advantage of a much lighter, much smaller gun is also that it can be used by a much lighter, much smaller person. As effective as the 12 gauge? Not by any measure. But is it effective enough? Looks okay to me. Now let's try something else. Now here's the definitive test for our .410 shotgun, the meat target. Now for those who haven't seen it, it's a pork steak to simulate a pectoral muscle, followed by pork ribs, our watermelon lung tissue, more pork ribs on the back. We'll cover it with our leather jacket skin. The lining of the leather jacket will act as rudimentary clothing. We've got our fleece bullet stop behind it, and we'll shoot it from 7 yards with our Federal .410 3-inch Magnum triple-aught buck 5 pellet. Let's see what happens. So how'd we do? Well, at 7 yards, those buckshot pellets did not spread out at all. They just made one big hole through our pork steak, one hole through our ribs, hit a rib and broke it, one big hole in our watermelon, chewed up the inside of the watermelon a little bit, then one hole out the ribs on the back, went through to the 15th layer of fleece where I found all 5 pellets together. Now, by contrast, when we shoot the meat target with 9mm 40 Smith & Wesson or 45 ACP hollow points, those bullets are almost always stopped by the first layer of fleece, and this buckshot went through to the 15th. So it seems like we have a good potential for overpenetration, and really no spread in the shot pattern, and moderate damage. So let's set up another meat target and shoot it again and see what happens. Now we've got a new meat target set up, and I'll shoot it with another round of the Federal .410 3-inch Magnum triple-aught buck 5 pellet. But this time I'll shoot from 10 yards, and we'll see if we can get that pattern to spread out a little bit and see what happens. So how'd we do? Well, at 10 yards the pattern spread out just a little bit. So when we hit our pork steak on the front, chewed it up a little. In the ribs, where they hit the ribs, broke them. And you can see how the pattern is spread out just a little bit more on the watermelon. So the interior of the watermelon is chewed up quite a bit more. Now the ribs on the back, you see 3 exit holes because 3 of the pellets are still really close together and then 2 more are spread out a little bit. But the biggest difference is in shooting at 10 yards instead of 7, allowing that pattern to spread out just a little meant that all 5 of the projectiles were stopped by the leather jacket skin on the back or the first layer of fleece. So we get more damage and less penetration. Unfortunately, 10 yards is probably a lot farther than you really shoot in a home defense situation. 7 is more realistic, and 4 or 5 is more realistic than that. Now you may have seen our presentation on birdshot in your home defense shotgun, and a heavy load of birdshot in something like a 12 gauge can do a lot of damage at close range. But what will it do out of a .410? Well, I'm going to go back 5 yards and I'm going to shoot this with Federal .410 3-inch Magnum 11/16 ounce of number 6 lead birdshot. Let's see what happens. Well, for as tight as the buckshot pattern was at 7 yards, the birdshot pattern at 5 yards is by comparison huge. And although it peppered our pork steak pectoral really well, most of the pellets were stopped in the ribs. A lot of them are just stuck in the rind of the watermelon. And you go through, and there's a few that got in there, and I'm seeing a few that got through almost to the back, but none actually went out the back of the watermelon. So, for as effective as the .410 buckshot can be, I'd say the birdshot is questionable at best. So what's the takeaway of everything we've seen today? Well, the .410 does have some advantages. significantly less recoil than the bigger guns, and depending on which model of 410 shotgun you buy, you can get a gun that's very short, light, and maneuverable. But the big question is it powerful enough to be a viable home defense shotgun? Well, although I'm aware of a couple of cases where people have murdered each other with 410 shotguns that were loaded with Birdshot, I'm going to say the Birdshot was not sufficient. But I was impressed by the performance of the triple-aught buckshot against the meat target. That had a lot of penetration and did a significant amount of damage. But is it powerful enough to be used as your home defense shotgun? Nobody can decide that for you except you. Now there's one other thing I want to add to today's presentation. I own Mossberg shotguns. I've shot a lot of them over the years. I've had a lot of success with them. But I do not want today's presentation to be inferred as an endorsement of the Mossberg Model 510 410 shotgun. I'm really kind of disappointed in it. I found that the action is rough, and when it goes to loading it, it's really awkward to get those 410 shells into the tube. Not only that, even though I've taken the plug out of this tube, this gun's capacity with the 3-inch ammunition is only 2 + 1. And granted, in a home defense shooting where the gun in question is a shotgun, the most common number of rounds to be fired is 1 or 2. So 3 should be sufficient, but I was still kind of disappointed when I'm accustomed to dealing with Mossbergs that have a capacity of 6 + 1 when it comes to 3-inch Magnum ammunition. So, as always, don't try this at home on what you call a professional, and thanks for watching the 410 shotgun video.